The Principled BSDF. It's the default shader in Blender and it's got so many options, so it must be good, right? But what do all these sliders do and how do you use them? Well, I'll walk you through every setting and what it means in the real world so you can use this shader to make almost any material you want. Firstly, I'll be using cycles for this video because some of these settings just straight up don't work in Eevee. Now, these first two dropdowns here allow you to select the calculation methods that Blender uses to render out the materials. In general, you're going to be using these to choose between faster and less accurate or more physically accurate but slower. The first option chooses the scattering method that Blender uses, and you get to choose between GGX and multi-scatter GGX. In physical terms, imagine a light beam hitting a surface that is perfectly smooth, even at the microscopic level. The light will always bounce off at the same angle that it came in at. Now, in the real world, materials aren't perfectly smooth. They have microscopic bumps that make the light bounce off at different angles. Sometimes light can bounce off one bump and hit another bump before it gets scattered away. Multi-scatter GGX attempts to mimic this behavior and simulates light bouncing around on the surface before it leaves. Plain GGX simplifies this a little bit and ignores these extra bounces, treating the material as a single surface that light hits and then bounces off, nothing else. It doesn't bounce around on the surface. As you can imagine, GGX is a faster method, taking about 5% less time than multi-scatter on this image, but the shadows are a little bit darker than they should be in real life. The difference though is really small, and it's even less visible when your materials are more reflective anyways, since it's just difference in how the roughness of a material is treated. So generally just leave it on GGX and you won't notice unless you render out a multi-scatter version and flip between the two like I'm doing here. I'll skip random walk right now and come back to it in a second when we're talking about subsurface. Base color is basically what it sounds like. It's the color the material will appear when it's getting hit by white light. Of course, colored light will add its own tint to the appearance of a material. You'll notice that there's this input right here where you can connect another node to allow more complex colors or patterns, useful for adding in an image or even procedural textures. Now for subsurface. When light interacts with most real-world materials, it doesn't just hit the surface and bounce off. It passes between the molecules and bounces around a bit before exiting somewhere else. If the material is thin enough, it can even scatter out on the opposite side. The subsurface slider controls how much of this effect is present. Generally, this effect should be pretty small or even absent entirely, especially since it can increase render times dramatically. Really, the only time you would need this is when you're rendering something like skin, wax, or leaves, something that you might see a glow through if you were to shine a strong flashlight through it. Now that you know what subsurface scattering is, let's get back to that random walk dropdown. Like with the scattering option, you're going to choose the way that Blender calculates the subsurface scattering. I'm not going to pretend to know how the math works, but Christensen-Burley is just an approximation, so it is by far the fastest of the three options. Random walk fixed radius is a little bit slower, but it looks quite a bit more realistic. Vanilla random walk, though, is by far the slowest, but the most realistic. However, where both the random walk methods struggle is with open and intersecting meshes. Take the Suzanne head, for example. Around the eyes, you'll notice that there is a dark blue tinge that isn't present in the Christensen-Burley render. Granted, that one has more of a blue tinge overall, but at least it isn't drawing attention to the eyes. Anyways, this is because the eyes are actually separate islands, pun emphatically intended, and the sockets are openings in the main geometry. So if your mesh isn't closed, or if you just need the much faster render times, change this to Christensen-Burley, but otherwise leave it on the default. Unlike with scattering method, the subsurface method does actually play a much larger role in the look of the render, and if you're already going to the effort of using subsurface scattering, you may as well do it right. Subsurface radius is a bit weird since it looks like a dropdown, but when you click it, it's actually a vector, but the vector corresponds to color channels, so why didn't they just make it a color input instead of a vector? Well, this vector controls how far each light channel can penetrate into the surface, so even though it corresponds to the RGB color channels, it isn't actually describing a color, even though playing with it will show that you can create color tints with this vector and you can control it with a color input. But what it's actually doing is saying in meters how far the light can go into the surface. That part's important. Since the scale is in meters, the actual size of your object matters. If you're like me and modeling objects that would be small in real life at a scale of several meters, then this can really mess things up. So just pay attention to your object size if you're using subsurface scattering. A quick note, the default values are calibrated pretty well for skin, so if that's what you're doing, great. Otherwise, you may need to tweak the ratios a little bit. Subsurface color is a lot like the base color, but it only adds a tint to the subsurface interactions, not the surface interactions. Subsurface IOR is, in the words of the Blender manual, the index of refraction for subsurface scattering. Not very descriptive, I know. I can't really explain how it works, but when your scattering method is set to a random walk, not the fixed radius version, it does affect the look of the scattering. There isn't really a lot of information out there on this feature as it was only added earlier this year as far as I can tell, so you can just play around with it a little bit and figure out what looks good to you. If you've ever used the anisotropy setting in the Principled volume shader, you should be pretty familiar with subsurface anisotropy. It acts as a sort of bias for the direction the light rays will bounce. Unlike with the Principled volume anisotropy though, this one ranges from 0 to 1 rather than -1 to 1, where 0 tends to scatter the light in the direction it was originally traveling and 1 tends to scatter it back to where it came from. See how the front faces show more of the white light when anisotropy is set to 1? That's the front-facing light being reflected back toward the camera. When anisotropy is set to 0, you can see more of the orange sky passing through the back of the Suzanne head. There's a lot that goes into the subsurface settings, but unless you're going for a really particular look, the only ones you really need to worry about are the calculation method, how much subsurface to use, and the color. The radius might be a bit useful, but otherwise, the others are almost more trouble than they're worth unless you know exactly what you're doing. Well, this isn't a subsurface scattering tutorial, so let's move on to some settings that you'll probably end up using a lot more, starting with the metallic slider. In the most basic terms, it's pretty much what it sounds like. Typically a 1 or 0 value that determines if the material is a metal or not. What it actually means physically though is a lot more in depth, so skip to here if you want to get past the physics lesson. Remember how I said before that most materials actually let a bit of light in to bounce around before exiting? Well, that actually applies to pretty much everything except metals. Luckily for us though, for most materials, the subsurface radius is normally so small that we can approximate it with a diffuse reflection rather than needing to use full-fledged subsurface scattering. This name comes from the fact that light gets diffused through the surface of the material. Metals though don't have a diffuse reflection. Light either bounces off the surface, gets absorbed, or passes clean through. In practical terms, think about a piece of aluminum foil. If you shine a flashlight at it or even hold it up to the sun, you won't see through it. But take pretty much any non-metallic material that's the same thickness, and you'll see a glow of the light behind it. That's because if the material is thin enough, the light can diffuse through it before it can reflect out. Since the aluminum doesn't have any diffusion, the light just bounces out. Of course, diffuse materials can reflect light from the surface as well, and that's called the specular reflection, and that's where your roughness slider comes into play, which we'll get to in a bit. Where the metallic slider really comes into play is the color and brightness of the reflections. When light hits a non-metallic substance, the color of it comes from the diffuse reflections. Since the color comes from the subsurface scattering, the light that doesn't diffuse into the material, the specular reflections, are unaffected by the color of the surface. It's essentially white. Since metals don't have a diffuse reflection, their color comes from the surface reflections. Therefore, their specular reflections are colored whatever the material is. That's what gives metals their characteristic metalness. Another particular side effect of metals' lack of diffusion is that they also tend to look darker on average as they get smoother. This is because a perfectly smooth metal is basically a mirror. All of the light that hits it bounces off at the same angle it came in. A diffuse material behaves the same way for its specular highlights, but the diffusion layer continues to scatter light beneath the surface and reflect light in different directions. So you'll continue to get what is essentially a subsurface glow that illuminates the entire exposed surface. It is possible to make a non-metal that looks exactly like a metal, but only if you set the base color to black for the non-metal to eliminate any subsurface reflections, then use a dark shade of gray to match the metal to it. Not very practical, but it's interesting. One more note on the metallic slider. Typically you're only going to use a 0 or a 1 or metalness map, but there are fringe cases where you could use an in-between value. Really small transitions between metal and non-metal can look a bit more natural than hard lines, and using high partial values like 0.99 or so can mimic a thin layer of dust or grime on metal. I don't know if that's physically accurate or not, but it looks right. Since the color and brightness of a metal's specular reflection is determined by the base color, we need a different control for the specular reflection of non-metals. This is where the specular and specular tint sliders come in. Specular controls the brightness of non-metal reflections. So let's go back to that non-metal metal material that I made. Since we've set the base color to black, the only thing we're seeing is specular reflections, the part that doesn't go into the surface. If we change the specular to 0.5, the reflection gets a bit darker. If we go down to 0, it just goes completely black, since both the diffuse and specular reflectances are 0. If we were to then bring back in some of the base color, you'll see that we don't get any of the hard reflections we were getting before, since now we're only seeing diffuse reflections. Bring back the specular, and we've just recreated the basic workflow that you would have had to use before the Principled BSDF was introduced in Blender 2.79 way back in 2017. As for the specular tint, that just reintroduces some of the base color into the specular reflections. You can kind of think of it as a mix slider between a white tinted reflection and a base color tinted reflection. Like I said before though, you'll typically just leave this at 0 since the vast majority of non-metallic materials have uncolored reflections. This slider is mostly just a stylistic tool rather than one that will help you create realistic materials. Now for a small physics lesson, so skip to here to get to the roughness section. The specular slider is calibrated for a reflectance range of 0 to 8%, which is the most common range for real materials. However, some materials can be more reflective than that, like diamond for example. So the Blender devs do allow you to put in higher values like 2 or 2.5, something like that. There's a formula to calculate the actual values that you can find in the manual if you know the index of refraction for the subsurface scattering, but just know that the default of 0.5 works for most situations. So unless you know the albedo of a material you're trying to replicate, just leave it as is. Or you can use it stylistically to create more brilliant reflections, but be careful not to take it too far. Anyways, on to roughness. I keep on mentioning roughness and how it affects your reflections, but what is it? Practically, it's essentially the blurriness of your reflections. A low roughness will be a perfectly smooth material like a well-polished mirror or shiny plastic, something you can see your reflection in. Physically, it's those tiny microscopic bumps I mentioned in the beginning. The bigger and more random those bumps, the more random the light bounces off the surface. Most materials will fall somewhere between 0 and 1, the exceptions being high-quality mirrors and extremely diffuse surfaces. Even then, I like to give most highly reflective surfaces a really small roughness value since very few materials are actually perfectly reflective. One of the easiest ways to add a bit of realism to your materials is to take a noise texture and put that through a color ramp set to a narrow range of values to mimic small differences in the roughness of a material. Combined with bump mapping, which we'll get to in a bit, it can make a big difference. Anisotropic is a weird one that is absolutely necessary to creating a very specific type of material and has almost no use outside of that. Like with subsurface anisotropy, it alters the directionality of reflections, but here it stretches them. You'd know it best from its use on the bottom of pans or brushed metal, but it's used for any situation where the roughness tends to be a little bit less random on the macroscopic scale. Most commonly, it's used when there might be some really small bumps that tend to streak across the material, or when the material itself is a collection of strands, like hair. Since this depends on variations in the roughness, it is most visible when the surface is somewhat rough, but not so rough that reflections are completely diffused. Not in the diffuse versus metallic sense. Also, it can help when the material is a bit darker so that reflections stand out a bit more. That's why this effect can be so pronounced in metals. There's no diffuse reflections in the diffuse versus metallic sense to mask it. Anisotropic rotation is pretty self-explanatory. It just rotates the direction that reflections are stretched. Sheen is another weird one that is very useful for a specific material, in this case fabric type materials. It adds reflectivity to the Fresnel. In other words, when you're looking at the material from the side, so its normal, like this, is almost perpendicular to the viewing angle, like that, then it catches a little bit extra light as though there's fuzz or something on the surface that is catching the light a bit. Notice how without the sheen, this cloth looks pretty flat, like it's more made of plastic or clay. And again, like before, the sheen tint functions as a mix between white sheen and the base color. The clear coat is an interesting function in that it mimics an additional thin, colorless layer on top of your surface. You can see how these sharp reflections get added on top of the more diffuse reflections of the base layer. Essentially, it's acting like a polish on top of an otherwise rough surface. When you see a material that you wouldn't expect to have particularly strong reflections like wood, but it's still shiny, that's a clear coat. The most common example is, of course, car paint. The clear coat roughness is what it sounds like. It's just the roughness of the clear coat layer. To talk about the index of refraction, we have to talk about transmission as well. Transmission basically mixes everything above it with a glass shader. And so, as you might imagine, the index of refraction functions like the index of refraction on a glass shader. If you've got the GGX distribution function selected, you'll also notice this option here for transmission roughness. This gives a slightly different look from using the vanilla roughness, but I'm not really sure which one is more physically accurate. An important thing to note is that you can't exactly replicate the glass BSDF look using the Principled BSDF. I'm not sure why there's a difference or which one is even more accurate, but just keep that in mind if you're going to be creating a glass material. Emission and emission strength both utilize the node as an emission shader. Blender defaults to the emission strength being 1 but emitting black, aka nothing. To actually start emitting anything, you'll need to bring up the color and go from there. Do note that Blender treats this as something like a mix shader between the Principled BSDF and an emission shader, but not quite. It seems like using the emission in the Principled BSDF functions more as an add blending mode as opposed to simply mixing between the two. So you will get a different look depending on how you decide to use this. And then we have the alpha slider. It's basically mixing with a transparent shader. Mostly useful when you're using an image texture that has an alpha channel, kind of like this little tree branch right here. If we plug this into the base color and then look at our Principled BSDF, you'll see that you can still see all the black stuff here. So we can just take our alpha, plug that into our alpha input right there, and it's gone, and now it's just treating it as though we had modeled the whole thing. So you can just use this to avoid having to actually model out really complex things like this if you're using image textures. Finally, we're getting on to these last few options. These last three aren't sliders that you can adjust, but rather inputs that are designed for you to connect a texture map or procedural texture or something to modify the appearance of the material. I'll start with tangent since it's the one I understand the least and I don't want to end with it. Basically, it alters the stretching behavior of anisotropic materials. So typically stretching happens around the z-axis, but you could use tangent maps or even your own custom maps to have it stretch in a different way. For example, using a tangent node set to UV map, and then if we put our UV map into here, we plug that into our tangent, and you can see that it actually stretches it more linearly, as though it were brushed metal rather than a frying pan, or something like that. I've not worked with anisotropic materials enough to really have a good grasp on this. But the normal input is something that I use almost all the time. Since it's not a slider that you can just play around with, it's not something that beginners really utilize at the beginning of their journey, but it is easily one of the best methods to add realism to a material. To understand how it works, let's travel back down to the microscopic level one more time. You already know that roughness comes from variations in the surface that cause light to be scattered in all different directions. Since these variations are so small, we can't see them directly and they just look like diffuse light. But what happens when these variations get big enough that we can see them? Well, we start to see little differences in shadows and brightness levels from the bumps getting shaded or deflecting light in different directions. This is what people generally refer to when they talk about the texture of a material. The normal input is quite literally a way for us to override the existing normals of the geometry, at least as far as the shader calculations are concerned. When we connect these normal maps, we're telling Blender to treat the surface at that point as having the normal that is specified in the normal map. So when rendering out the image, Blender will act as though there was actual geometry that is creating these little bumps and textures that we see. Of course, there won't actually be any bumps there, so the effect won't hold up at extreme angles or for large deviations from the actual geometry, and also the silhouette won't be affected either. So like you can see here, the edges of our material, even though it looks all bumpy and everything, the way it's responding to light, there are still like these perfectly flat edges all the way around this object. All that aside, here's how you actually use the normal input. You have two options. If you're using a set of image textures like this brick texture right here, you might have something with it called a normal map, which looks something like this. You can import that into an image texture node and set the color space from sRGB to non-color. That will make sure that Blender is actually interpreting the data contained within this file correctly, and otherwise it'll just look a little bit weird. Now you might think that you could just take this normal map and connect it to the normal input of our Principled BSDF, but if you do that, it looks really weird, especially right here on like the side of this cube right now. And if we just rotate it around, you can see how it's actually kind of just changing the way it looks, almost like it's changing shape as we're rotating it. It's a bit weird. And the reason for that is that the normal input is actually looking for normals relative to the world space. So if we just take a geometry node like this and look at the normal output, you can see how each side of it is colored a different direction based on the direction it's facing. So if I'm rotating this around, the color actually changes depending on how we're rotating it. And each of these faces is actually a coordinate that describes the direction of the normal. So if we take a look at this red face right here, you can see that the normal is just pointing out in the X direction like that, which gives it a normal vector of 1, 0, 0, which if we just do a direct translation to RGB like that, then that gives us a red value of 1, a green value of 0, and a blue value of 0. So that's why the color of this face is just pure red. And then for the y vector, you know, it's 0, 1, 0, which gives us a 0 for the red, 1 for green, and 0 for blue. That is all describing the actual normals of the geometry itself. So if we just take this normal output, and connect this to the normal of our Principled BSDF, you can see that nothing actually changes from if we were to just not have anything connected at all. That's because it's taking the normal input of the normal. It's saying take itself and use it as its own normal. So What that's actually telling us is that this is looking for some sort of modification of these colors that we have right here. As we're rotating it around, these change, the values actually change a little bit. So the actual texture, the normal map that we have, it's actually given in kind of the world normal space. And as a result, it's not responding to the rotation of the object at all. It's just saying, this is the direction the normal faces, which might work for some faces, but it doesn't work for all of them because, it's not changing as the object rotates around. So we need to take our normal map here and then actually combine it with the normals of the geometry as it exists, so that when we're rotating it and everything, it responds correctly and it's not just saying all of the faces have the same normals, because they don't. They have different normals and we want them to be a little bit different. So we do that with a normal map node. So that just takes our normal map and converts that into something that looks a bit like this. And you can see it still has all of the features of just the plain normal map, but it's outputting in the actual object normal space like that. So as we're rotating it around, you can see that the colors actually change and everything like that. That's what the normal input is looking for. If we then just connect this to the normal input, it looks right. It looks proper. And we can actually change it and bump up the strength like that. And you can see we're getting little shading on this brick texture right here. As we bump it up and down, it looks like it actually has a little bit of shape to it. It's responding to the light and casting shadows on itself a little bit. Now that's all good if you have a normal map that you're using, but if you don't have a normal map and you want to generate your own, like procedurally or something like that, say using a noise texture to make little bumps based on this, then you use something called a bump node, which just takes a black and white input like a noise texture factor and converts that into a normal map as well. So if we look at the output of our bump node, then you can see how it's actually converting this black and white texture into a normal map, kind of similar to what we had over here with this one. So you see it kind of has, the same color profile for each of the faces, but this time with a different texture. And if we say take that instead, plug this into our normal, then we're getting a different kind of shape right here. We can bump down the strength quite a bit so that it's just kind of barely there like that. And then you can see we're getting little bumps in the material. It's good for adding procedural noise and everything like that. And on top of all that, you can actually combine our normal map that we have here with a bump node by just taking the normal output, plugging it into the normal, and then now that's all combined together. The bump node is kind of it passes through the normal map and then just combines it with whatever we're bringing in and using as bump mapping as well. And you can do this for any black and white texture as well, the bump node. If we take, this logo here for the channel, it's black and white sort of, it's, grayscale. Plug this into our height right there because it's a black and white texture. Then we can actually bump up the strength and you can start to see the shape of my logo in there like that. And it looks like it's actually a part of the wall and it's a little texture on top of that. And that's how you use a normal map. It's super helpful for adding realism to it because, if we disconnect all this stuff and we just have this brick texture, it's a very flat brick texture and it doesn't really look that good. Plug this normal map into here and now it looks like it actually is three-dimensional, has some shape and randomness and all that good stuff that goes with it. Looks a lot better. And finally, the Clearcoat Normal. It's exactly the same as the normal input, but only affects the Clearcoat layer if you have that enabled. You should use the same normal map as for the regular input, since a thin layer like this would also follow the contours of the surface it's on, but you can modify it slightly for additional imperfections to make it look like its own thing. So let's just take our Clearcoat and bring that up all the way. Make it look like we have some sort of Clearcoat on here. We will not use the bump node for the regular normal input. We'll just take our normal map like that. And then we'll use our bump node with the noise texture that we have instead of my logo. Let's disconnect that and hook up our noise texture there. And we'll use this one since it's combining our normal map with a little bit of extra detail. Combine that and put that into our Clearcoat Normal. And now you can see it looks like our bricks are kind of coated with a sort of waxy coating like this, and it has a little bit of extra shape. You could just plug in the normal directly and it would look like the bricks are coated with something, just plug this in instead, and it's just got a little bit of extra noise on top of that. And that is how you use the Clearcoat Normal as well. So there you go, everything you need to know about the Principled BSDF. I know it was a long video, but I hope that you'll be able to use this anytime you have a question about this particular node. It's definitely the most versatile shader node available, so there was a lot to go over. If you have any questions about anything I glossed over or anything else, feel free to let me know in the comments down below, but otherwise have a great day and I'll see you on the next video. I'm John Martinez and this has been Learn Together Filmmaking.